Hello everyone. So first of all, I'll address the fact that you can see my neck in this review, but we're not here just to discuss that. We're here to discuss The Other Side by Alfred Kubin. Now I have struggled to do this review. This is a difficult book, a very surreal and allegorical book. I did like a 20-minute review and thought it just was a little bit too rambly, just kept forgetting things. I'm going to try and force myself to be a little bit brief, try and keep brevity in mind. This is a surrealistic work, a German work that was published in 1908 and translated into English fairly soon, shortly after, by an illustrator called Alfred Kubin. Very much impressionistic, surrealist artist. Quite good artist actually. The book has comparisons to Gormenghast in quite a few ways. For example, it deals with a settlement that is hidden from view. It's a segregated society called the Dream Realm, and within the Dream Realm is a city called Peril. And the start of the book I really quite enjoyed. It begins with a nameless protagonist who has a friend in high school called Patera. Little hint as to his role. Patera, pater, the father. He's the father, we learn, of the Dream Realm. Now, I'll say that I am going to give spoilers for this review. It's a very difficult book to review. Highly confusing. A lot of people said the same thing. It's meant to be confusing, so there will be spoilers in this review. So we learn that this Patera character, who the protagonist knew in high school, has come into a colossal inheritance. He travelled to Asia. He saved a woman's life. Her husband gave him a colossal sum of money, and then eventually, for various reasons, he creates this dream realm in Asia, beside the settlement of blue-eyed, I believe it's Mongolian peoples. So that's really the premise of The Other Side. The protagonist is given an invitation to Peril, to the Dream Realm. He's very hesitant at first, but he eventually he thinks he's an artist himself, and he thinks that he's enticed eventually by the Dream Realm and the idea of the Dream Realm, and so he goes eventually with his wife to the Dream Realm, all the way from Munich to, I believe it's Uzbekistan, Samarkand, I believe is a specific location. And then from there, that's really where the story starts. This book, it's a very strange book, a very surreal book. From the very start, the protagonist and his wife are they've ridden on camels into the waste, and they see this colossal wall and a huge tunnel, this black tunnel, quite good imagery. And from the moment they enter that, they get this strange feeling of terror. They feel that something isn't quite right with Peril, and this is a dark book. It does not feel like it's a dark book from the start, but it is. It throws you off, because the first part is very much a standard adventure novel. It's strange and quite whimsical and odd, and a lot of things are unexplained. But the second part is where it falls falls down for me, essentially. So Peril is a realm where, or the Dream Realm and the city of Peril is a place where it seems to be anti-modernist. The specific ideal created by Patera, this enigmatic figure who we barely meet in the story. Peril is a place where there's no sun and no moon. Everything is sort of olive tinted, very dark and dusky and murky. Everyone seems to act according to their own rules. It's quite interesting. For example, money will just be handed over. You pretend you hand money over and you'll get something for free. Things will cost a certain amount of money one day, then it's a different amount, maybe more the next. People seem to act in odd ways that don't seem to add up with how we would react. It's a very strange book. And they wear, so it's anti-modernist, they wear clothing from the 1860s and earlier. So it's very segregated, it's different, it's anti-modern, it's a segregated settlement that's distinct from every other sort of culture, I suppose. I say that, but what I was just thinking there is that another element to peril is the buildings seem to be the buildings are transposed, I suppose, from Europe to Asia. There seems to be some sort of ideology where everything is old in this settlement. These old buildings are transposed. Literally, the foundations are packed up and then taken. This is all backstory, how peril came to be, really. The buildings are taken from Europe to Asia. They're dilapidated, for example. Broken chairs and whatnot, old time pieces. There's this quite funny scene where where the wife and the husband and the wife have to relinquish some of their items because they're not old enough, I believe. And so that's really just an idea of what peril is like, and there's a decent map in the back. Sorry, at the front. Yeah, if you can see this. So I'll say this is not a fantasy book. It's surreal and imaginative, but it's not a fantasy book. It's very much a sort of Kafkaesque sort of. It reminds me of Kafka, Camus, The Plague, Crime and Punishment a little bit, various books like that. It's not a fantasy book. We have the post office, we have the mortuary, brickworks, the dairy, we've got theatre and stuff like that, palace gardens, etc. It's sort of it's a book. It's a setting in the 1900s, I suppose. It's just slightly weird and odd. So this book is very much, it's the comparisons to Gormenghast. I can't remember if I said that at the beginning of the review, but there's a lot of comparisons to Gormenghast. I can see why. It's definitely has that quite a few elements. For example, there's a settlement just outside of the main city of Peril, where there are these blue-eyed, I believe it's Mongolians, I think. These strange, again, quite enigmatic. There's a lot of enigmatic people in this book. Enigmatic tribe or race that exist outside, and not many people know about them. That's one element that's quite similar to the outsiders in Gormenghast. So that's one element. The other element is that it's really, again, it's quite a dark book. You don't get the sense of how dark it is from the start. Also, there's quite kooky and sort of quirky and whimsical characters as well. It's quite somewhat of a funny book, actually. And there's a part of the back where it says blackly funny and boldly imagined. It definitely has those elements to it. And so here, just before waffle on it any longer, so this will be the spoiler part of the review. Eventually, they enter the husband and wife get accustomed to peril. P-E-A-R-L, not P-E-R-I-L, of course. They get accustomed to the city. They don the old clothes. They figure out the customs, and they spend a few years in peril. Throughout this time, the main character, this artist, who's landed a job with the Dream Mirror, which is a publication in peril, one of the publications. The other one is The Voice, which I'll talk about later. His main goal was to try and contact Patera, his old school friend, who is seemingly the father of the Dream Realm, who created the Dream Realm, and peril. And things don't go too well for him. It's very Kafkaesque, and there's a lot of, again, Gormenghast and Kafka's stuff, the trial and the castle, very much connected with this work. Things don't go too well for him. There's a lot of bureaucratic paperwork to fill out, and he just doesn't seem to get anywhere. Eventually, again, spoilers, he does get somewhere, and we figure out that Patera is not quite a man. To be honest, I've done some analysis beforehand, but I'm not entirely sure what his symbolism is. I believe there's some sort of Gnostic element. He seems to be everywhere. He controls the people of peril and also the elements around the Dream Realm. This figure with long, blondish brown hair and eyes that are like mirrors, I believe, bright discs. It's a very philosophical work. Very, for example, I'm sort of going from thing to thing here, but there's a barber who I believe is interested in Schopenhauer, or is it Heidegger? There's mentions. There's a quite funny scene where I believe the barber, this philosophical barber, is trying to discuss the thing in itself with the concept of the world in itself and the thing in itself with his monkey, who helps around the shop, the barber shop. There's a lot of elements that I probably just went over my head, but it's that type of book. It's a literary type of book. So the main character can't quite get in touch with Patera. He eventually does. He figures out he's not quite a man. And that's really honestly where the story it lingers in that sort of space. And from there, I quite enjoyed that element of it, learning the customs of peril. But it does get quite strange and unexplained. There's for example, there's a part where the protagonist, on the behest of his wife, who becomes somewhat anxiety driven, succumbs to anxiety. She fears Patera, and she thinks she's seen him in the streets. She at her behest, he goes to I believe it's the mill or the dairy, and eventually he comes to this underground section where there's a pale horse. I believe it is like a literal nightmare. So the concept of the nightmare, the horse, the white horse, this emaciated horse. There's strange elements like that, which are kind of unexplained. There's another very strange element to the setting and the plot, the Great Clock Spell, where for some reason, and the protagonist again is just as confused as I was. They go into this clock tower and they stare at a wall, and I believe they say something, and then they stare for about 30 seconds and then leave quite happy. There's a lot of occult, I think, elements to it, and a lot of allegory and symbolism that probably just went over my head against that type of book. So there's elements like that. There's even one. Connected with the horse. There's a thing called the brainstorm, which seems to be connected with Patera. But again, these are all things you can figure out for yourself. I'm not going to dwell on them too much. And that's really where the first part, that's where it lingers. Now the second part, unfortunately, I didn't really enjoy. It seems to be that the characters fall by the wayside, and it's very, very introspective in the first part. The protagonist is very introspective, and here's a spoiler that I will give just to highlight his introspection that I quite enjoyed. His wife eventually dies from these anxiety attacks and fearing her life in peril. And there's a whole section where he just wanders the streets and mourning, and it quite reminded me of stuff like Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov, just wandering the streets and the dark alleyways and whatnot. So there's that element that I really liked. But then in the second part, everything becomes very detached. So there's a character called the American, who is his real name is Hercules Bell, who comes in and tries to usurp Patera, this enigmatic leader, and he creates what is called the Lucifer Club, and you can probably tell from that it's sort of like Lucifer trying to dethrone God, that sort of thing. The old reign to the new reign. And from there, everything that the characters do doesn't seem to really connect with the events that occur in peril. For example, just one thing after leads to another. One day everyone falls asleep at their desks and at their jobs. There's another part where there's a huge influx, actually quite a significant part of the story, a huge influx of animals, that the city seems to be taken over by the animals, by crocodiles, and from the river south of the city. There's also leopards and camels and birds and other monkeys and whatnot. There's very strange, very peculiar, quite comical sometimes. Everything seems to crumble and become even more derelict than it already is. And I think what I got from it is that as the status quo is changed and disturbed by Hercules Bell, the Americanist capitalist who tries to come in and change everything. Patera, this sort of Gnostic, if I'm using the word correctly, this sort of all-pervading figure, tries to influence and possibly halt Hercules Bell. And from there it just gets really dark. There's everyone kills each other, earthquakes and whatnot, and eventually everything crumbles. And it felt like vignettes to me, to be honest. In the latter part of the book, they're just like these little parts where it just goes away from the protagonist, and we'll have just these characters that we don't really know and they're not really developed, are doing this thing, they're trying to rob this particular mansion or whatever. This happens to the barber, this happens to Hector von Brendel, this artist friend of the protagonist. Actually, no, he wasn't the artist, somebody else. But just all these different characters that aren't quite developed, but we sort of see from their lens, from their point of view. And just everything that happens just doesn't seem to really... It's sort of like... it reminds me of like an avalanche just sweeping away the introspection and the characters of the novel, of the protagonist, everything. We still get the protagonist's viewpoint, but it just becomes a series of weird events. Now, that was alright, that's decent. And again, there are elements with the blue-eyed tribe, the Mongols, I believe, Mongolian people. It's not quite clear what they're about. They somewhat help. I'm struggling here. They somewhat help the protagonist understand, I guess, the philosophy behind peril. It's quite a tricky thing to describe. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it for you to decide. But I'll get on to the last part of this book. This is where it becomes almost like a fever dream. It reminds me, it's almost like a more human version of House on the Borderland, where there's just a character just staring into space and watching millions of years go by. We'll see as everything crumbles and goes to ruin, and people start hanging themselves and all sorts of decadent events. Patera seems to... I believe he dies in the end. Actually, another thing, I'm just putting out these references here, it reminds me almost, it's on the same mythological, allegorical and symbolical level of The Golden Key by George MacDonald. It's on that level, it gets very strange. For example, I'll just skip a little bit and I'll say that Patera eventually becomes as large as the world. Probably weren't expecting that. He becomes as large as the world, and so does the American, and they're almost like titans that fight in a sort of like a dream sequence in a vision sequence that the protagonist eventually has. The protagonist is up in this mountain sanctuary, saved by the blue-eyed people, and he seems to have these strange visions where mountains are just crushed underneath Patera's feet. He's this godlike figure, and everything almost becomes like a kaleidoscope. There's kaleidoscopic imagery. It's very, very strange. Some sort of Freudian elements in there. For example, there's I believe it's maybe the American's penis becomes extremely large, as large as the world, and his head is like attached to it. You can see where this is going. It's very strange, and that's kind of how the story ends. If you're into strange books, surreal books, dreamlike books, I'd definitely give The Other Side a go. I tried to do some analysis on it, and I did understand some parts of it, but it really is fairly difficult to get your head around. There's a lot of different interpretations, of course. And then there's this section at the end where Patera seems to come back alive, or he seems to shed his negative side, and and he goes into this chamber. This quite this description is fragmentary. It makes no sense. I realise what I'm saying probably doesn't help you at all. He goes into his chamber and seems to self-annihilate, and he comes out with white hair. You see, I think there's a little bit just too many strange elements for it to really feel like you're connected with the book at all. It's this book where it sort of just ends on a sort of philosophical treatise, and the very last page is this: the demiurge is a hybrid. I'll leave you to figure out what that means. I like to think I've read a fair amount of sort of intellectual books. I think I'll be struggling with this one for quite some time. I'd definitely say that it's a good book for the first half. Second part has some sort of nice imagery to it, but overall I would say that I wouldn't really recommend the second half. It's definitely you can see how this connects with Vericonium and Gormenghast and all these sort of more modernist and experimental books and works of fiction. I just think it could have perhaps been told in a more human way and been a little bit more grounded, because I just sort of struggled understanding it by the end. So that was The Other Side, written by Alfred Kubin, translated by Mike Mitchell. So I will be discussing Mathaga Wood next, I believe. So I hope you enjoyed the review. I'll see you next time. Cheers.